I just present myself as a system scientist. And I say, look, let's look at the pros and cons. We do an analysis. We have techniques like life cycle analysis, and you compare the impacts and you make decisions accordingly. And I do say there's always trade-offs. It's a matter of which trade-offs you want to accept. So I think if you approach it that way rather than in a dogmatic way, then people are understanding of it.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we make the case for conserving nature and its biodiversity by building a robust, credible argument, one that sometimes requires us to re-examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. This episode does not argue against renewable energy, and this should be stated up front. Renewables are essential to decarbonization. But it does ask what the transition looks like when you account for materials, extraction, and infrastructure. The clean energy transition is often framed as a straightforward swap. Renewables replace fossil fuels, emissions fall, problem solved. But beneath that story sits a harder set of questions. How material intensive is a renewables-led grid really? What happens when you account for the steel, concrete, and critical minerals that make wind, solar, and battery storage possible? And if mining expands dramatically to enable decarbonization, what are the environmental and social trade-offs? To explain these questions, I spoke with Saleem Ali, a systems scientist and industrial ecologist who studies the materials energy nexus, the idea that energy systems are constrained not only by fuels and emissions, but by infrastructure, extraction, and supply chains. We talk about why wind and solar can be surprisingly material heavy up front, how storage options like pumped hydro compare with large battery farms, why nuclear and biofuels remain part of the conversation, and what a more pragmatic approach looks like when every option carries trade-offs. I began by asking Saleem how his attention was drawn to this topic in the first place.
The scale of the infrastructure investment around wind power, particularly, I think that really made me very conscious. I remembered seeing one day this massive wind tower being transported, just the tower
Mhm.
itself. And, that was a small one. And then I was like, this is unbelievable amount of infrastructure which we will need to actually generate the kind of energy that we want requires a lot of materials. And I'm not even talking about the critical minerals for the magnets and all, just the steel and the aluminum and the physical materials, concrete that's needed in many cases for wind, particularly offshore wind. It's phenomenal.
Mhm.
So then, the rare earths crisis in 2012, that really alerted the world to the importance of these minerals for the green transition. This was when China clamped down on its supply of these minerals. And at the time, a lot of the concerns were around defense. But in terms of volume, the materials are needed far more for green infrastructure, batteries, and magnets, solar panels themselves, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I think 2012 was a real inflection point in terms of global awareness. And for me, I mean, as someone who studies materials and as works on an industrial ecology perspective around minerals, I've always been interested in what we call the material energy nexus. How much material do you need to generate electricity, not just from the point of view of fuel, but the infrastructure you need to harness it.
Mhm.
So that's how I became very interested in this.
Mm.
And we also published a paper in 2022, which was around the material needs for energy generation. And we looked at the amount of materials needed per terawatt hour of electricity generation. And and solar are astonishingly high in that
Mm.
regard. If you
Mm.
compare that to, and hydropower also is pretty high, but most of it is concrete. And that paper was really focused on that aspect of this question, but also in terms of fuel usage. Of course, you do not need fuel for wind and solar. So you have the massive infrastructure cost up front, but then you don't have the fuel cost, which you do have with fossil fuels and for nuclear energy, you also need fuel. So in terms of infrastructure per unit energy generation, nuclear comes out really good in terms of the amount of material needed, but you do need the fuel.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, just to kind of jump straight into the big question, and I realize that it's a really big one that you won't be able to answer simply, but maybe we can sort of start digging at it. And that question is like, what is the true impact of renewables versus fossil fuels versus nuclear? I mean, this is kind of the big question, right? But despite, I mean, I'm a biodiversity guy, so I don't really spend a huge amount of my time looking into this specifically, but checking the news every now and again and listening in on conversations among renewables oriented colleagues, I never really hear that question answered, or if it is, then it'll be just sort of tiny little hints here and there. So you mentioned the fuel issue. Renewables don't require fuel, and nuclear requires very small amounts of fuel. But then there are all these other material costs that you spoke about. And I'm particularly, well, one thing I'm particularly interested is batteries, and how they factor into all of this, because renewables being non-baseload power, unless they have an entire backup system, they're more or less worthless without batteries, right? So, sorry, I've crammed a lot in there, but the main question is, what is the true impact of renewables versus these other traditional sources of energy?
Yeah, I mean, the battery storage aspect is this major material usage issue, except for if you use pumped hydro as a battery, you know,
Uh-huh.
and that is possible. It depends on the topography of where you are. Then you don't need the batteries which require all these metals and so on.
So what
Uh,
you mean by pumped hydro is sort of on a very large scale, pumping river water back into a dam and letting it run through generators again?
Essentially, what it means is like if you have solar and wind being generated at a certain time when you can't use it,
Hmm.
instead of then putting it in a battery, you just use it to pump water up a hill
Mm.
or, at a higher elevation where it has potential energy. And then it becomes like a battery.
Mm.
And when you need it, you just run it down the turbine.
Right.
So, pumped hydro, I mean, overall, if you think about energy storage capacity, that is the largest way in which we store energy
Hmm.
is through hydro, storing it in that way.
Is that
So
quite common? Is that a common way of sort of compensating for the non-baseload nature of wind and solar?
yeah, it is in certain areas where you have the topography to
Right, you
do
need
it.
that.
Yeah, it's much more so at a larger scale, you use it in that form.
Hmm.
But yeah, you don't have that ability to do it in flat areas, and
Mm.
your batteries give you far more versatility. So there is going to be that aspect of the importance of these large battery farms for renewable energy grids to be effective down the road. I think the role of natural gas or biofuels, particularly, is still going to be important. I
Mm.
don't think that wind and solar can, on their own, manage this situation. And certainly, nuclear can play a role, but nuclear also has its constraints because of cost in many cases.
Mm.
I think cost will go down, and nuclear certainly has many carbon advantages. So nuclear, I think, has a future definitely, and one which needs to be explored, both fission and fusion. I mean, fusion until
Mm.
recently was very much pie in the sky, but now it's becoming much more realistic. And
Hmm.
even countries which are opposed to nuclear fission energy, like Germany, they are very amenable to nuclear fusion energy
Mm.
research. So that's one to keep an eye on, and it's now much closer to reality than we would have thought even 5 years ago.
Hmm.
But that too will have material needs, Like some of these companies which are developing nuclear fusion reactors, they require several critical metals of all kinds,
Hmm.
so that they're just for the mechanisms by which they'll generate the power. In some cases, they're magnets, in some other cases, they're different kind of catalysts. And so we'll have to keep an eye on this. But overall, when it comes to coal, I think coal is definitely on the exit.
Hmm.
Just the cost factors are clear, but natural gas and oil, we'll see, how many more years of transition we need. I think we should keep an eye on biofuels also. I know for environmentalists and conservationists, they have been anathema to them, but they have versatility. I mean, they do have it, they have the same advantages that oil and gas have. So for mobile fuels, for when you're talking about aircraft, you're talking about even some kinds of cars where you may find them to be quite efficient. So I think we need to keep that option open.
Especially from a waste crop point of view, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if there are I don't know what the figures are here, but I know there are basically two different ways of using biofuels. Either you grow a crop for the purpose of biofuel, or you use an existing crop or the residue from an existing crop
Yeah,
for
and
biofuel, which is
cellulosic ethanol, yeah,
right.
using the waste material of plants more so, and then using that to develop it rather than using cash crops like corn. I mean, the bigger concern with biofuels was when we were using large amounts of land
Mm,
to generate them and having deforestation as a result, and food security issues so that the crops are being replaced. But if you're using waste material, cellulose, which is byproduct of the food crop production, you have a win-win, and there is
hmm
much more great. And then there's algae, of course, which has a lot of potential.
hmm
And we've seen massive investment in algae for biofuels, even with companies like Boeing, for aviation fuel. So I think part of the problem with environmentalism is it tends to become very nihilistic at certain levels, where like you can't do that, you can't do that. It's like you can't do anything and you just have to hunker down and reduce consumption. Well, the reality is, much as we may want to, and yes, we should try to aim to conserve and reduce consumption,
hmm
you have plenty of people in the world who are already consuming too little. Yeah, there's still 800 million people without electricity connections. You can't expect them to consume less. So at some level, you will have to consume more, and we have to plan for these better, smarter ways to do it.
Right. And I guess a big part of solving the future is to just be open to all the possibilities, right? To keep all of these cards on the table so that none of them are ruled out
Yeah,
entirely. Even the ones that are more polluting, I guess. I mean, I guess the one that comes to mind there is, as you mentioned, is liquid natural gas,
yeah.
which is, as far as I understand, been responsible for incredible reductions in emissions in the US in particular.
Hmm.
And yet, the more extreme environmentalists would want to take that off the table entirely in
Yeah.
favor of renewables.
Yeah, I mean, that was the big debate at COP30 was, they could not get through. They wanted a complete fossil fuel phase out commitment, and they weren't able to get that because of the concerns that some kinds of natural gas, particularly, will be necessary for the foreseeable future to meet some of these kinds of needs for fuels where you don't have flexibility for the variety of reasons we've talked about.
Right.
And hydrogen is going to be potentially playing a role, but right now a lot of the hydrogen comes from natural gas. So
hmm
then, we have to think about other sources. And ammonia is similarly the way forward potentially for shipping. A lot of people are now focusing on ammonia instead of diesel. It's much better than diesel for shipping, but most of the ammonia is produced from natural gas currently. So how do we get green ammonia? And then that's going to be used for shipping.
hmm
So that's being commercialized now slowly. So there are going to be all these other innovations that which are derived from fossil fuels but are more efficient, more effective.
hmm If you compare, I mean, I'm assuming that liquid natural gas is probably the cleanest or the best of the fossil fuel options. Maybe there's something I don't know about there, but but it's certainly one of the cleanest. If you consider LNG and then compare it with something like wind or solar, and then you sort of tally up all the environmental and maybe social costs as well. Where do you end up? I mean, or in fact, maybe put the social costs aside for a moment because that makes things even more
Yeah.
complicated. But just in terms of environmental costs, when you take all of these materials and the different materials that are required for renewables as opposed to fossil fuels, where do you end up? I mean, is there a clear winner in that race, or does it depend very much on the context?
Well, I mean, natural gas is in itself the key transition fuel. LNG is just the way of transporting it, right?
Okay.
So you can have pipelines or you can have LNG. And pipelines environmentally, in many cases, for shorter distances are much more efficient than LNG because LNG requires energy. You have to first liquefy it, then you have to deliquefy it, and all. If you just transport the gas by pipeline, you don't have to do that.
Okay.
So that's one of the arguments for, these pipelines that were built from Russia to Europe was they were much more efficient because you didn't have to do all this other stuff. So Nord
Hmm.
Stream and all those were, and the distance was not that great. So it made sense. For the US, they've used LNG because they can't build huge pipelines across the Atlantic. So that for very large distances, like US exporting to Asia, then LNG makes sense. But pipelines should be considered. Unfortunately, the geopolitics made pipelines problematic, and it's a real pity that Nord Stream 2 was blown up by whoever did it. It's clear now the Ukrainians were involved, though they have arrested some people also now. I mean, the Europeans realized it was a crime, really. And in
Hmm.
fact, the carbon emissions of the Ukraine war, a very large percentage, like 15%, can be attributed just to that blowing up of the pipeline, which was a horrible thing. I mean, it maybe makes geostrategic thing about Russia and all that, but we've had these kinds of blunders that have happened on both sides of the political spectrum. So that's with the natural gas, the transport mechanism linked to the distance we have to keep an eye on. Then there's the biogas, which is not fossil fuels, but it's still methane. It's
Hmm.
coming from you find sources like landfills and all to generate the methane, and that methane can feed into the same natural gas supply, but
Hmm.
it's coming potentially from a more circular economy source. So it's also one to keep an eye on how much we can generate through that.
Hmm. Now, generally speaking, I mean, if you sort of have a very short time to convince someone of, how we should be focusing on energy production, would your point of view be that, we should keep going with renewables, but we shouldn't take other options off the table? Or would you be saying that, some renewables are really just too energy intensive to be worth considering? Like or
Yeah.
are you just an energy mix advocate?
No, I mean, I think we need to keep them in the mix, and certainly wind power in the US is astonishing that it is now the largest source of renewable energy in America is wind power.
Hmm.
Despite Trump's opposition to wind power, the infrastructure has already been put in. It's more than hydro, which is astonishing.
Hmm.
America, which built the great dams like the Grand Coulee and Glen Canyon and Hoover, it is now producing more energy from wind than from hydro. And that's pretty good. 10% of the entire country's power is coming from wind. So it's making an impact, and that it should continue. But 100% renewable, very difficult in the foreseeable future.
Hmm.
Perhaps it's doable in the long run, but it will require massive amount of investment. It is physically possible. It's even financially possible, but it will require that level of investment, and we have to then think about the impact in terms of the material extraction and all for making that work. And the case for using nuclear and other sources to supplement it is quite good. Plus, you want to diversify because you want to have resilience. The more the resilience of the different sources, then the better it is for you also in the long run.
Right. And looking at mining in particular, as you alluded to earlier, the kind of mining required for coal production, for example, is very different to what is needed for renewable energy production. And I guess very simply put, from a layperson's point of view, when you dig for coal, I mean, it's almost 100% coal, right, that you're taking out of the ground.
Yeah.
When you're mining for renewables, including batteries, assuming you don't have the infrastructure and the topography to do the hydro pumping that you spoke about, you're probably going to be mining all sorts of different chemicals, lithium, cobalt, nickel
Mm.
from different parts of the world. So how does I guess in terms of quantity, the coal must be far larger, but then the type of mining and the quality of mining, is that so disproportionately harmful when it comes to renewables compared to coal?
Some of these metals have been mined historically, like nickel. There's a long history of mining nickel for steel production. Now we would be using the nickel more for battery production.
Hmm.
So some of these are existing mines with new usage. We can have now much better circular economy around iron and steel. So maybe we don't need as much mining for some of those other kinds of materials. And so we are able to, and we're also moving to composites and other kinds of materials. So we have less demand for certain kinds of steel as a result. So, those mines which were producing nickel for those sources could be used for this. The main new metal, which has not been mined before as much, is lithium.
Hmm.
And because lithium is a relatively new metal in terms of its massive usage, the way we are using it now for lithium ion batteries. And so for that, there has been a totally new industry developing.
Hmm.
And there are different ways to mine lithium. Some are more problematic than others. In the lithium mined in the Atacama Desert. A lot of opposition has come to that because you need large tracts of land. You need a lot of water in areas where water is scarce. You have to evaporate these basins to get the lithium. But
Hmm.
you have also some more efficient ways of mining lithium. Like we have the geothermal brines in Germany. They've done a great job. They're producing geothermal energy and they're mining lithium from subterranean sources. So you have the Salton Sea in the US, where there are lithium deposits which can be mined in a much more environmentally conscious way. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of good news on some of these metals and mining them efficiently. Um, the rare earths are a challenge because the rare earths are found in very low concentrations and they require a lot of chemicals to make them available in economically viable form. And the concentration in recycled products is lower than in the ore. So there's a very low economic incentive to recycle, to get rare earths from recycled materials.
Uh-huh.
That may change. It may require subsidies from governments to encourage more circular economy extraction of some of these metals, and then you need less mining, so it's less damaging. So I think we need a strategy which considers all of these aspects to it. It can be done. It's not completely out of the question. Plus, there's also the development imperative of mining, that it does create jobs in places where you may not
Mm.
have them. So in Congo, you have cobalt. Often people talk about all the problems with cobalt in Congo with child labor and so on, but it is 60% of the world's cobalt is coming from there, and it's a source of huge livelihoods in a very poor country. So you have to think about also the livelihood opportunities that are created by mining in certain areas where they don't have many other alternatives, and maybe
Right.
it can kickstart another economy. Certainly, your country of origin, South Africa, is a classic case. There's no doubt South Africa's huge development profile now would not be there without mining. It has a service sector economy, it has so much else, but the origin of the wealth, the capital generation came from mining.
Yeah.
So the same is true in many other places too, where it can happen. Botswana, your neighbor, is classic case too. It is a country which provides free healthcare, free education, all of that. And there's no question it is because of diamonds. So mining can play a really important development role, where the case for it is more the development side, even if there's an environmental cost associated with it.
Hmm.
And the biggest example of that is gold. I mean, from an ecological point of view, we shouldn't be mining gold. We
Mm.
have more gold above ground than is in economically viable reserves, and it is actually eminently recyclable. It's lying in bank vaults. We don't even use it. It's
Yeah.
just an asset. So we don't really need to mine gold for utilitarian purposes, but we do it largely because of the livelihood imperative. There's
Hmm.
so many countries which depend on it, and if we use the gold in the bank supply, by the bank vaults which is there, where we don't even have a gold standard, we don't necessarily need it in many cases. It create a huge problem for countries like Ghana, whose entire budgets are dependent on gold
Yeah.
taxation revenue. So these are other factors we have to keep in mind.
Seeing as you mentioned gold, does gold have any role in renewables production?
Very minor, very
Okay.
minor. I mean, yeah,
Platinum is quite important, isn't it?
platinum is more important for
Hmm.
hydrogen fuel cells, the platinum group metals, the PGMs as we call them. And South Africa is the largest producer by far of the platinum group metals.
Right.
So, yes, they are used more in catalysts and also in these fuel cells. But gold, very little in terms of, you know, the most gold is used in jewelry.
Yeah.
80% of gold is used in jewelry. Small amounts are used, yes, in certain medical equipment devices, but that
Mm.
amount can easily come from recycled sources.
Mm.
There's no mining imperative for it.
Yeah. Pardon my ignorance, but you mentioned rare earths, and then you're talking about metals like lithium and cobalt and nickel. What is the difference?
Yeah, so the rare earth elements, if you look at the periodic table, usually we refer to them as those elements at the bottom of the periodic table, what we call the lanthanides and actinides. The top row is the lanthanides. A lot of those are the rare earths, and sometimes people add a few other metals which have similar characteristics also in the periodic table. But within the transition metals, we call those the transition metals.
Okay.
So the rare earths fall within that. Lithium is totally different. It's the lightest metal on the periodic table.
Hmm.
It is right under hydrogen. So it's very light. It's in the same group as potassium and sodium. So it's not a rare earth. It's very different in its chemistry.
Hmm.
So rare earths, when we're talking about neodymium, dysprosium, europium, these kinds of metals which are in that group.
Okay. And then just quickly to pick up on something else that you mentioned, about lithium mining in particular, you said was a relatively new form of mining, or at least at the scale that it's being done now. Is there still, I mean, I guess one form of mining can learn lessons from other forms of mining, but is it true that, a new form of mining is going to always be a little bit more destructive to start off with before they refine the way of doing it, and then it kind of becomes better, more efficient over time? Is that kind of part of the issue that, maybe in future lithium will become less of a destructive practice, lithium mining?
Well, some of these new techniques have been devised completely for new deposits, like the German ones I told you about, the geothermal brines, where that's a very clean process, relatively speaking, and
Hmm.
it's new and it's a new deposit. Of course, there's continuous improvement with extraction techniques, even with conventional mining, but some of it has to do with the kind of deposit that you find, and then you innovate to use the right technique to extract from that.
Right. Okay. Then just to kind of move to kind of a different topic. My perception is that many environmentalists are relentless critics of fossil fuel and also nuclear fuel, so uranium and plutonium, I guess. And yet they're very quiet when it comes to, and maybe even defensive when it comes to similar or worse impacts of green mining. And we've spoken a bit about those impacts now. But where do you think that sort of selective focus comes from? What's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it comes from the fact that they're looking at it as a planetary problem. And, climate change and carbon emissions are considered that kind of meta level planetary problem, whereas these other issues we're talking about extraction are more at the site level. And the environmentalists are correct that if you want to compare extraction impacts, I mean, oil and gas extraction, if you're comparing green mining impacts, oil and gas extraction has its impact too. I mean, look at Nigeria and the Niger Delta.
Mm.
It's a total disaster zone in terms of the environmental and social impact because it wasn't well regulated at all. You can have cleaner ways of oil extraction, like Norway has shown, and even in the ocean, which is, a very delicate environment. But most of Norway's oil comes from the marine environment, and they've done a very good job in extracting it responsibly.
Hmm.
So both cases, you can find ways to do it right, but at the same time, you have this bigger problem that there's a planetary challenge of climate change, and so fossil fuels not only are they causing the extraction problem, but they're causing the emissions problem.
Mm.
And so, whereas with the green mining, yes, there's the extraction problem, but at least you are moving towards a solution and in the long run, you once you have that infrastructure, then you can recycle it. You can hopefully not need to go on and on extracting.
Hmm.
So there is this feeling that a lot of times, the fossil fuel industry wants to stigmatize renewables through this label of, well, they're mining and there's child labor and all that. But all of that also exists with the oil and gas industry.
Right,
So it's
right,
not
right.
like they're completely clean on that. But that leads me to the question of deep sea mining, which is an interesting one because there you don't have as many social problems because you don't have communities being displaced, but you have this issue of biodiversity and conservation,
Hmm.
which is an unknown in terms of what the impact will be. But then again, it's all about the trade-offs. Then, is it nickel mining in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle, where you have all this potential impact on the marine and the terrestrial environment,
Hmm.
versus nodules in the deep sea, where you may have unknown impact on these ecosystems we don't know much about, but there's clearly not any direct social impact.
Hmm.
So, those are also interesting trade-offs we'll have to consider moving forward with reference to the green transition elements.
And also, I guess, purely from an extraction point of view, and never mind emissions, but from an extraction point of view, I've got to imagine that the number of holes in the ground, sizes of holes in the ground that are required for coal, at least for coal. I guess oil and gas are a little bit more tricky here, but at least for coal is going to be, orders of magnitude larger than for all of the materials required for renewable energy, right?
Well, it's hard to say, because some of these metals are in smaller concentration, so you still have to extract a lot of material, process it. You have tailings, you have waste rock. So, the actual waste footprint of certain kinds of metal mining can be considerable. And with
Hmm.
coal, many cases we have high grade coal, you just start extracting. A lot of coal mining is underground, so you don't have necessarily always holes in the ground or like open pit mines. That some
Hmm.
of it is strip mining, but a lot of it has been historically underground. So, I mean, the bigger problem with coal is occupational safety and hazards
Mm.
because coal mining can lead to combustible, very dangerous situations, similar to oil and gas extraction. And you don't have that with critical metals.
Right.
So you have, t towns in Pennsylvania like Centerville, which have been burning for 30 years because there's no way to, once you have these coal gases that have started ignition, you can't put them out.
Yeah.
Those kinds of challenges you don't have with the metal mining.
Salim, in your work and your kind of public outreach, to the extent that you do public outreach related to your work, you're kind of taking I suppose you could say, a heterodox or a introspective look at, among other things, renewables, mining, and the use of renewables. Do you get any kind of pushback against that from the point of view that, you shouldn't be criticizing something which is heading in the right direction? We should all be pushing this renewables machine forward and not putting any pebbles in the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just present myself as a system scientist. And I say, look, let's look at the pros and cons. We do an analysis. We have techniques like life cycle analysis, and you compare the impacts and you make decisions accordingly. And I do say there's always trade-offs. It's a matter of which trade-offs you want to accept.
Hmm.
So I think if you approach it that way rather than in a dogmatic way, then people are understanding of it. And that's how I've approached it. I do get pushback, especially on deep sea mining, because right now that is a kind of campaign which the environmentalists have that is similar to the anti-nuclear campaign. So it is like a non-negotiable issue. They won't even hear anything favorable about it.
Hmm.
That's the only area where I do get some pushback because I'm willing to say, well, wait a minute, let's just give it a chance
Hmm.
and see what the relative impacts are. Let's consider the fact that if these metals are extracted from the ocean, then we don't have to maybe mine it in other vulnerable ecosystems.
Hmm.
And we do have an international governance mechanism for deep sea mining, which we do not have for terrestrial mining. We have no
Hmm.
international legal mechanism to regulate terrestrial mining. It's all
Hmm.
national laws. Here you have an international governance mechanism through the Law of the Sea Convention. So, at least it gives an opportunity for standard setting
Hmm.
with greater enforceability if we went through that process. And one of my concerns has been the environmentalists have opposed deep sea mining and undermined the International Seabed Authority and the Law of the Sea Convention to the point where countries like the US have said we'll just unilaterally go ahead and do it.
Hmm.
And so, they've kind of won the battle and lost the war
Hmm.
because then you have a worse situation. Because if then any country says we'll just go ahead and do it in the high seas, technically they're allowed to do it because there's no international law that would prevent them.
Hmm.
But if they play by the rules, then you have a greater chance to do it properly. So,
Right. Yeah, I often find it is that unyielding, all or nothing sort of attitude of extreme environmentalism, which does very often shoot itself in the foot and just sort of closes itself off to all sorts of solutions as well. So it
yeah.
can be very counterproductive.
Yeah, there's this moral hazard argument that environmentalists use, which is a problem because it prevents innovation. A moral hazard argument being like, oh, if you present a solution, then you won't solve the original problem. But the reality is, you can't just solve the original problem through reduction in consumption, which is what they're trying to do. In many cases, if you live in a free society, there are limits to what you can curtail people from consuming.
Hmm.
And so then you have to figure out some other technological options
Right.
because otherwise you are in a losing proposition. If you can't change behavior completely, much as you wish to, and you don't have a solution, then you're really lost. So finding a solution shouldn't always, this moral hazard argument shouldn't, it kind of leads to paralysis, then you don't move forward. That is unfortunately what's happened with some environmental activism.
Right. That actually brings me very nicely to the last question that I wanted to ask you, which was kind of what this means going forward. Giving everything that you've seen, where do you think we should be putting the emphasis to minimize harm without losing progress, I guess? Should it be dramatically better recycling and urban mining, substitution of materials, technological efficiency, tighter regulation, which is a very different kind of approach?
Yeah.
A bigger role for nuclear, or what kind of combination? You've already hinted that we should be keeping all the options on the table, but what are the highest leverage moves right now, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, we have this. I'm serving on the UN Secretary General's advisory board on zero waste. And in the zero waste movement, even though it's thermodynamically impossible to have zero waste,
Hmm.
it's a good aspirational goal. We have this thing called the zero waste hierarchy, where you go with that. It's like, okay, you start off with the fact that you want to design products to reduce the amount of material usage overall and consumption. But then you go down the hierarchy and see eventually it's like you want to be able to then recycle, refurbish. You have different ways in doing it. And
Hmm.
then the last one, which we try not to even include in zero waste, is then you burn the waste and make energy out of it.
Hmm.
But generally speaking, zero waste, people say don't do that because that creates that incentive. But there's a lot incentive to just produce waste. If you make waste an asset, then and to burn it, then you were using it in the wrong way. If you use it as waste as an asset, as a material asset, then that's a positive. That's the kind of approach I would try to bring in. Same with nuclear energy. So nuclear energy, we have now really good opportunities to use nuclear waste to generate, reprocessing nuclear waste. And France has shown there are two companies now which are actually doing that.
Hmm.
So that's the best win-win outcome you can have. You can deal with, nuclear waste, and you can have a circular economy around nuclear waste and energy generation. We'll have that potentially with thorium reactors if we develop them and so on. Same kind of approach being applied to nuclear energy as well.
Hmm.
It has been expensive to make it work initially, but I think once it is upscaled, it's a very good prospect moving
Right.
forward.
What you said now reminds me of that reduce, reuse, recycle slogan. First,
Mhm.
first reduce, then reuse, then recycle in that order. So going down the
Yeah,
hierarchy as you mentioned.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then in between, we have some of these other ways of, remanufacturing, also redesigning and all that as well. So that fits
Hmm.
into the hierarchy.
Right, right. But it sounds like you are a bit of a techno optimist. I mean, would you describe
Mhm.
yourself that way?
Yeah, I mean the term techno-optimist has acquired a negative label also
Hmm.
in environmental circles. I would say I'm a techno-pragmatist. I don't say that technology is going to solve all our problems,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I think technology is essential to invest in because we cannot rely just on consumption reduction, given that we live in often in liberal societies where people have some level of individual choice.
Hmm.
You can educate them, you can regulate them, but there are going to be limits to that.
Hmm.
And So in that context, we have to find some technologies to be able to then address when consumption is continuing to increase.
Right. Yeah. Salim, do you think there's anything that I should have asked you that we didn't get around to? I mean, from my point of view, my sort of limited knowledge point of view, I think we covered a lot there, and that was pretty comprehensive. But do you think there's any major gaps
Thank
there?
you. Well, one thing I would mention to you is that, I've been advocating for a global governance system around minerals. And recently, actually, we published a paper in Science, and it was about the idea of a minerals trust for the green transition. That given we have all these problems and controversies about minerals, and we have this race to the bottom often occurring between countries that are trying to be self-reliant, but then doing it by using very ecologically inefficient
Mm,
ore deposits, that we should have a trust for the green transition of minerals, where countries are feeling confident that if they need minerals for green technologies, that no one is going to weaponize the supply. So you have assurance. So we argued for this, and it was also published as a policy brief with the United Nations University, which you can have a look at. I think that's something that we are now working on to move that forward as a policy innovation to prevent this conflict between the US and the West and China, particularly on green mineral sourcing, so that if there is a trust and you have both, the trustees would be both supplying and consuming countries. So there is more security around supply for
hmm
the green transition. And we don't end up using new mines, opening new mines just because people want to be mineral secure. But we use the existing ones efficiently as long as there's assurance on trade that there will be supply security through
hmm
this trust mechanism.
hmm
And there would also then be a stockpile. You could use the trust to lease metals so that you have more product take back. So metals which may be used temporarily for certain uses, you could lease them back into the trust. So it would be also a much better way to have a circular economy. So that's something we've been working on.